At MDIC, we conduct our activities for the public good through our projects, and our annual public forum is the opportunity that we have to tell the public about the progress that we've made. So for the next hour, we're going to invite our panelists to give you an update on our 4 projects that you haven't heard from already and the progress that we've made. So I'll invite our panelists up: Suzanne Schwartz, Ross Jaffe, Kyle Myers, Rick Kuntz, Randy Schustel, and Chip Hance. And our format for today is each of our panelists have a slide that they will present to you from the podium. So they'll take my place here at the podium. And I'll ask them to take a few moments to introduce themselves and their role within MDIC, because we have truly an amazing panel of champions, both our board members that we have seated here, as well as our FDA champions, Suzanne and Kyle. Once they each give their comments, their opening comments, we'll open it up for questions from the floor. So our starting panelist is Suzanne Schwartz.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying. We really are now indeed down to the final stretch. And again, my name is Suzanne Schwartz. I'm the Associate Director for Science and Strategic Partnerships at CDRH. And I want to start off by saying how indeed excited I am in attending this annual public forum. This is the first MDIC forum that I have been able to participate in, and I'm looking forward to participating in many, many more in the future. I am overly delighted to be here. This panel has really the distinct pleasure to close out the forum after we've all taken in all of the very engaging and informative sessions that preceded us throughout the day. And there's an obvious common thread that runs throughout, that really links all these efforts. And that underlying core element is collaboration in the domain of regulatory science. There's no question that all of the great work that has been accomplished to date relies heavily upon that willingness to partner across organizations in order to achieve goals that are extremely difficult, and some might even say otherwise elusive. But what bears emphasis here is that this goes well beyond simply a willingness to partner. And it's worth spending a few moments on why collaboration across the many different disciplines and across the multiple organizations that make up our medical device ecosystem is so integral to advancing regulatory science. So let's first define what we mean by regulatory science. It is the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of FDA-regulated products. Regulatory science benefits patients by speeding the rate of important technologies reaching the market, and it reduces time and resources that are needed for device development, assessment, and review. Simply put, the bottom line is that through leveraging regulatory science, we can get devices to patients. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what's happening here, but we can get devices to patients faster without compromising our high standard of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and doing so in a more cost-effective manner. You know, there's a well-known quote that states, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success." But I'd like to take the liberty to tweak or modify that quote slightly, because after all, working together in and of itself may not actually define success. Yet working together to rally around a shared purpose and towards attainment of precise goals, well, now that's indeed success. And we started off the day with some very inspiring presentations on vision and priorities for FDA, for CDRH, for MDIC. And what's notable in the alignment in vision and strategic priorities is that they are all anchored also in this core framework, a framework that really resonates with all of us, I believe, who are here today, and that is the total product life cycle, the TPLC. In essence, the conceptual framework of the TPLC, well, to me, it bears an uncanny symmetry to what I'm calling the virtuous cycle of collaboration in regulatory science, which is really emblematic of MDIC's efforts to date. How so? So let's tease this apart a little bit, if you'll bear with me. So on a micro level, the total product life cycle of a device is that driver for constant iteration, constant iterations that enable device modifications and enhancements in order to address feedback that derives from end users, whether they're patients or providers. If we take that up a few 100,000 feet more to the macro scale or to the ecosystem level, the total product lifecycle framework is the driver for advancing patient-centered real-world evidence that can then feed back into this national evaluation system that will aid FDA in faster regulatory decision-making for new products, for new indications on existing products, and for more timely safety signals. Now, the nature of the current state of MDIC collaborations in regulatory science really mirrors this very concept of a virtuous cycle. I mean, picture, if you will, an image in which one successful outcome leads to more of a desired result and a next outcome and the next success, which further generates still more desired successes. That becomes kind of a self-propagating chain. And I find this totally energizing and truly transformative. So in 2015, CDRH published its first set of regulatory science priorities, and these priorities served as a catalyst for improving safety, effectiveness, quality, and performance of medical devices, and for facilitating the introduction of innovative medical devices into the marketplace. By identifying priorities, we're able to then focus on what the important gap areas are and the emerging needs in regulatory science. Today, we are really privileged to hear updates on current MDIC projects, and these align with CDRH's strategic and regulatory science research projects priorities as well. These efforts really represent the true promise of public-private partnerships in delivering that shared goal, that goal of getting patients faster access to more innovative, safer devices with reduced healthcare costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. So now we'll move to our board champion, Ross Jaffe, and the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Assessment Project.
Good. Well, thank you, Dawn. It's a pleasure to give you all an update on where we've come over the last year or so with the Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Project. Just by way of background, you'll recall that this PCBR project, as we call it, was one of the original 3 projects approved in the spring of 2013 when MDIC was formed. And that fall, in fall of 2013, we hired Stephanie Christopher, who has become our chief cat herder in terms of helping us get this project along, and formed a steering committee, which consisted of representative MDIC member organizations, a number of FDA staff, including a number of people here in the room, like Katie O'Callahan and Annie Saha and Mimi, as well as Telba Irony and Martin Ho and Randy Brockman and Bob Becker, who were actively involved in our discussions. And also a variety of patient groups, including Mark Booten, who you heard earlier, and Peter Saltonstall, and Kim McCleary of Faster Cures. And we also sought out a number of outside domain experts to help us as well. And we started a series of conversations over an 18-month period that resulted in our publication last spring, 2015, of the report entitled A Framework for Incorporating Information on Patient Preferences Regarding Benefits and Risk into Regulatory Assessment of New Medical Technology, which only goes to show that we're not very good at naming things, but that it fortunately has been a relatively popular report. It has been downloaded now over 1,000 times off the MDIC website, not only by medical device companies, but also by pharmaceutical companies and academics and regulatory consultants and patient groups, both here in the US and in Europe. So we hope that we've made a contribution in that report. What is most gratifying, I think, to all of us involved is that our discussions, I think, helped inform FDA thinking on this issue and resulted in and contributed to and is cited in the patient preference guidance that came out from FDA and was finalized this year. So it really shows potential impact of the work MDIC can in helping facilitate a discussion and thinking in a new area. What is also exciting, I think, for all of us involved is the quality of the discussion and how collaborative it was among all the parties. And I think that bodes well for other MDIC projects. We're continuing our efforts in this field, and let me highlight 4 major areas where we're continuing to work. The first is in developing a set of resources for sponsors who are considering undertaking a patient preference study, since this is a new field and many people aren't familiar with it. If you go to the MDIC website and look under the PCBR page, there's a growing list of resources, both the reports there, the FDA's own study of obesity, which was a seminal work in this area, is there. And then we're going to be adding a series of frequently asked questions that we get about the area. That'll be up later this year, as well as putting together a list of academic researchers and consultants and others who might be available to help with people considering undertaking that field. So we want to just see everything we can do to bring the resources to bear. As other studies are done and are published, we'll add those to that list and try to make the website valuable to people who are interested in doing work in this area. We've now, within our group, under the steering committee, formed a group to work on methodology issues. In other words, there are real methodological issues that arise in a new area like this in patient preference. And so we've formed a methodology working group. Earlier this year, we put out an RFP to academic groups for proposals to partner with us to pursue a particular study looking at comparing multiple methods and whether the multiple methods of assessing preference give consistent outcomes. And we've selected one group from among those and will now be looking to find a funding source to pursue some work in that area. A third area we're working on is trying to encourage industry members of MDIC to start undertaking patient preference studies. And what we'd particularly like to identify is a new emerging area of medical technology where there may be ability for multiple members to collaborate on helping to understand patient preferences in a new area and thereby help inform the regulators on how they might think about looking at that area in a manner not unlike what happened with the obesity study that CDRH did itself. So we're still working to identify that area. If any of the member companies here have ideas of areas that they're working in that they'd like to collaborate with us on undertaking a patient preference study, we'd be very much interested in entertaining that discussion. And our fourth area, we've talked a lot today about patient engagement in the sense of getting information from patients coming to us. But a very important piece related to this is how we communicate with patients about the risks and benefits of medical technology. And so we'd like to put together a white paper looking at the best practices for communicating with patients and with physicians on issues related to benefits and risks of medical technology. We have outlined what we'd like to do in that paper. We pursued one source of funding which didn't work out, and so we're continuing to look for other ways to fund that project because we need some outside support to do that. But that'll be another area, and try to really focus on how we can improve the communication of benefit risk information. So overall, we'll continue to work to advance the field of patient preference studies, and as just one aspect of what MDIC is trying to do in the broader field of patient engagement. And if you have any questions, please seek me out. I'd be glad to talk to you about it.
Thank you very much, Ross. So our next speaker is Kyle Myers, and she's not talking about one of our projects at MDIC. She's really talking about a combination of all of them. We've had a wonderful opportunity as we've developed as an organization to work within these projects and then evolve our thinking to understand how these projects overlap with one another to truly transform regulatory science. And so with that, I'll let Kyle take over.
Great, thank you, Dawn. I'm Kyle Myers. I am the Acting Director for the Office of Science and Engineering Labs, the lab program at CDRH, and I have had the pleasure of serving with Dawn as her partner within FDA. I serve as the PI for the Computational Modeling and Simulation Project. And the project that I want to tell you about today really does synthesize a number of efforts that we've been working on together with MDIC for the last couple of years. You've just heard Ross talking about patient-centered benefit risk and patient engagement. I'm very interested in computational modeling, and this project truly brings these efforts together. Our goal is to demonstrate the feasibility and acceptability of using patient preference explicitly to modify this uncertainty that would be allowable in a clinical trial. So what do I mean by that? We are used to making use of the same uncertainty when we do clinical trials, so the same level of willingness to accept that we've made an incorrect decision around either the safety or performance of a device of p-value of 0.05, our favorite value. And the idea here is that for low-risk devices and for patients for whom their risk tolerance might be high, that might be conservative for them, and that it might be that it would be acceptable to open up the error bars and still have a clinical trial that would give us an acceptable level of uncertainty in terms of what we've learned about the device. And of course, the converse is also true, that there may be spaces in which we need to be more protective of patients and to get more flexible in our thinking, informed by patients and supported by computational modeling. So the goal of this effort is to make use of a project involving a hypothetical medical device for therapy for Parkinson's patients. We took this idea to the Michael J. Fox Foundation last May and got tremendous support from them with the idea that we would partner with them and their patients to identify outcomes that would be relevant and important to patients, their caregivers, providers. And that would be the first aim of this effort. And then we would conduct a patient preference study, making use of the kinds of tools that Ross just alluded to that we've been developing internally and through our collaboration with MDIC. And Michael J. Fox has willingly offered to partner with us and make accessible to us up to something like 10,000 patients. So here again, this is a real opportunity for demonstrating in a real application with real patients how we might make use of these tools to change the way that we do clinical trials to increase access to patients with their preference in mind. The third effort of this, the third aim, is to make use of that patient engagement to and with modeling to determine how that patient preference information would allow us to adjust the clinical trial itself and come up with real quantitative information on the impact that we would find. And then the fourth aim is to bring that to stakeholders both within FDA and across the ecosystem to explain what we've done, assess acceptability of these methods, and truly grow the acceptability so that we have more and more understanding of the kinds of things that could be done like this, develop and disseminate the methods, and improve uptake. What I really appreciate also about this project is that while it's Parkinson's and we've got patients that are ready to be engaged and a real tangible platform to have this conversation, this is truly a generalizable method that could be applied to all manner of patients and devices. So we've been building towards making this project get wings this coming year, so I really look forward to coming back to you next year to tell you what we've learned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. I really appreciate it. And our next speaker is Rick Kuntz to talk about our clinical trial innovation and reform project.
Thanks, Don. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the Chief Medical and Clinical Officer for Medtronic and spent 11 years in industry, but before that I was in academia. And in order to give the motivation about why we're moving to leaning out clinical trials as an effort between both industry and the FDA, I want to just go through a very brief history of evidence-based medicine for medical technology. As you know, in the 1970s and 80s, Alvin Feinstein and David Sackett had brought on the era of evidence-based medicine, which generally put forward the hypothesis that decisions made in clinical medicine should be based on solid clinical data, which is derived from randomized controlled clinical trials. That's first started in the pharma area and really didn't affect medical devices until 1990s, early 1992, when the Temple Commission from the CDER came over to the device side and said, we need to move from registries to randomized controlled studies. So early on, there were some industry pioneers that took on this platform, one of which was Bill Hawkins in 1992, starting with randomized studies for directional atherectomy. And with that, clinical studies in medical technology in the 1990s completely converted over to clinical research studies, mainly using the tool of randomized controlled clinical trials. Academic research organizations popped up that started taking on this kind of work, the Duke Research Institute, the Harvard Clinical Research Institute that I ran. And we all tried to basically build up these studies to answer questions. But in the build-up, we also wanted to put away a lot of data so we could do a lot of publications. The tenure process in most academic institutions is based on authorship. There are a lot of reasons to leverage industry studies to do big studies. And this led to core laboratories, which had to be analyzed, and publication strategies, which would go on for many years based on the rich data from clinical trials. All this is well-meaning and with great intentions. However, the clinical studies got to be very big. In addition, the demand for evidence for clinical research went from one-off clinical trials to demand for all devices having some level of clinical research. So combining the growth of the size of an individual study with the increased exponential demand for clinical research really resulted in a true perfect storm. When I joined industry in Medtronic in 2005, the clinical research budget for that company is $150 million. That was in 2006. Last year, it's over $700 million. This is not a sustainable way to develop evidence, and we still have major evidence gaps. So we really need to work together to understand how to minimize our studies to answer important questions and minimize the amount of extra data we collect and extra time we collect to be able to use that money to answer more questions in evidence-based gaps. For example, a study that we did recently in a breakthrough therapy had 4,000 fields of information on the case report form. The average nurse took 32 hours to fill the data out. The data has been presented in major peer-reviewed journals, and generally the amount of fields used to win over peer-reviewed publications at top tier was about 60 to 80 fields, not 4,000. So the question is, what do you do with the other 3,900 fields? Well, the answer is we don't do much with them. That's been exposed by many National Academy and Institute of Medicine workshops, including studies dedicated to large, simple trials. So with that motivation in place, we decided to take this on in an effort with FDA and industry to try to understand how to come up with a process to lean out clinical trials. There have been efforts both in companies like ours, who basically developed a program a year and a half ago, and other companies have come to MDIC to show tricks and tips in order to move to core data sets and modular data rather than expansive one-off studies. Now, one of the reasons that this happens is that we have a deficit of clinical trialists, both in industry and in academia. So when project managers generally run clinical trials, try to develop a pathway or a new clinical study, they generally use the template of the old study and add new data on top of it. Because if they don't have confidence in what the clinical trial goals are, they don't know what data to eliminate. And they're fearful that they may eliminate something that's very important. So the effort to try to lean out studies is to improve the education of basic epidemiology and statistics for people in industry and in the Food and Drug Administration to understand how to measure type 1 error, which is the number of questions you can ask per clinical trial, to realize that when you have 4,000 fields of information, that once you get past the first 200, the rest of the data is meaningless. It really can't give you any information. And that requires us to do workshops, which we've had a few so far, some publications and joint publications we have in press with the, with the Food and Drug Administration, with a goal to both understand how to reduce this effort, educate people in the rank and file who do clinical research both in industry and the Food and Drug Administration, and to develop novel metrics of efficiency for clinical research, which is not as easy as you think, and develop a true framework for collaboration going forward. So that's what I wanted to talk about with this journey. The slide here has some summaries of this overall. I'll just move to the upper right-hand corner. We've had a lot of engagement in presentations so far outlining the Minnesota Divine and Medical Device Conference. We've had Society of Clinical Research Associates of Medical Device meetings that have tried to lay this out. We have a variety of joint MDIC meetings moving forward. We encourage engagement with all the stakeholders to try to drive this down. And we are trying to expose our aggressive approach to reducing clinical trials to criticism to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of clinical data. That's very, very important. So we're very excited about moving forward. We want to have a joint recognition that this is an important effort to move forward. And we want to balance the notion of getting more evidence and making trials smaller so that we can serve the public better. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
And of course, I might be a little bit biased, but we now get to talk about my favorite project, the Computer Modeling and Simulation Project. Randy Schistel.
Okay, thank you very much. Randy Schistel. I'm the board champion for the Computer Modeling and Simulation Project for the past 3 years. With the expert support from Don and Kyle, we've made some pretty good progress. So it's fun to be here today, 3 years after the start of the organization, and learning about what a private-public partnership was 3 years ago, to the point now of having a really effective organization, one that's recognized and valued, and has a building partnership between government, industry, academia, and other stakeholders. So thank you for attending, and thank you for being interested in computation modeling and simulation, because it is making a difference in the way we develop products, the way we make our submission, the way we work with FDA on approvals. We really do think about computation modeling and simulation as a big part of the ecosystem that affects safety, quality, efficacy, performance, value. It affects all elements of our ecosystem in med device. And we've been able to demonstrate that in a variety of projects over the last 3 years, moving from some early brainstorming sessions that Kyle ran and others, to some project ideas, to some really tangible projects and outcomes that you can look at in more detail on the website. You can talk to the members of our community and get more concrete examples of how to use modeling. But what we've learned is that everybody has done some level of modeling in their past. Everyone has done that. What we found is we've got a very fragmented community. And we might have a company with one modeler or one designer or a part-time or a consulting capability. Other companies might have a department of modelers and computational analysts. But this MDIC forum has allowed us to come together and build a more coherent community, even though a company might only have one of one within their own walls. This forum has allowed us to come together as an organization with a steering committee and a broad membership, doing monthly calls, doing MDICX webcasts, really communicating broadly about the value of computational modeling and simulation. And maybe that's one of the hardest areas that we've had to deal with is convincing our management teams in our companies what is the value of computational modeling and simulation. How do we bring that value proposition forward in a way that's tangible, that allows us to recognize the value and coalesce, leverage best practice, even build that capability within the companies. So that's been an area that I think we've definitely achieved a milestone. The feedback we get is pretty positive. the people that are attending and part of our community under MDIC really do believe that we've got a mechanism to help communicate the value of modeling and the value of simulation and how that is critical to our product development. As we started, we had some smaller projects, and as you've seen throughout the day today, the broader umbrella of the virtual patient. And you can see where these projects have become change factors in the way we develop products, the way we submit, the way we go through the approval cycle. The virtual patient framework does give us that bigger perspective of how modeling can be of high value to the ecosystem, industry and government. And we have a lot of academic partners as well. They are clearly part of our community. And when we think about modeling and simulation, we think really broadly about all those that either have a capability or an outcome derived from modeling and simulation. And we're still learning how to share. I think that's a big area for us to continue to grow. We're working in what we call this pre-competitive space, but yet we have a very competitive spirit in the community. So that's an area that we continue to grow, and we continue to share things that we can share comfortably, and over time we'll share more and more, and we'll get to the point where we can really leverage breakthrough ideas, not just ideas that are either retrospective or things that we've done in the past that are now more common practice. So when you watch what we do over the next 3 years, really be thinking about that kind of proactive leverage of computation modeling in the industry. Sharing knowledge is really important, especially in modeling and simulation, because that's where we can leverage our knowledge base and become much more efficient. That's where we can meet the bigger objective of bringing products to market in a really effective way, higher quality, lower cost, and first to the U.S. Thank you.
And then we live in the dynamic world, and we're meeting milestones on a daily basis. So I thought I'd share with everyone that our journal publication, the second one listed here, neuroengineering publication, electrical neurostimulation with imbalanced waveforms, just went live online mid-afternoon today. Wow. And with that, I will hand it over to Chip Hance and our newest project, the application of clinical trial practices.
Thanks, Don, and congratulations. My name's Chip Hance. I'm the board champion for this particular ACTP project, which you've heard a lot about today. My background is 25 years in the medical device industry in both diagnostics and cardiovascular devices, and involved with a lot of clinical trials through the course of that, which was a great experience. And I had the pleasure and opportunity to be invited to be an entrepreneur in residence in 2012 at the FDA, and co-led with Katie O'Callahan the work on trying to streamline clinical trial review process within the FDA. And I learned very firsthand the benefits of collaboration between different stakeholders, and we felt afterwards that a real transformation in that particular aspect of the review process happened. And so I've been a big fan of this collaboration opportunity ever since. And so I was really delighted to have the opportunity to step into this, which is the newest project, which was formed just about a year ago today. And it came about because Rick described some of the work on the clinical trials area where we could simplify clinical trials. And the computational modeling group had developed some new concepts, and we saw that there was an intersection between these two areas to really drive some operational activities where we could really try and translate it into real actionable actions that companies could work at and come together in a collaborative way. So that's really the vision of this particular group, these clinical trial activities. Can we operationalize the efforts in those areas to make them tangible and real and get them adopted on a widespread basis? You've heard a lot about it, so I don't think we need to get into too much detail, but we were able to form a steering committee this past fall who has been able to guide us in this project and identify some additional projects we would work on. We've had increasing engagement from various different stakeholders and different companies participating with that. And then you saw some of the evidence through the course of the day today about what we've accomplished, several retrospective analyses demonstrating real, tangible reductions that could be achievable in a clinical study by bringing in data and finding ways to statistically amalgamate that with the existing clinical data. We want to take that further and actually get more retrospective studies done. We would like to get more companies to prospectively make use of that tool, and we'd like to carry these retrospective analyses forward to some kind of endpoint so we can really communicate to all stakeholders involved of what would be the endpoint of doing these kinds of studies. And the other thing that we've been able to identify is some additional operational projects that we'd like to begin in, perhaps in the real-world evidence area, perhaps in the reimbursement and some of the discussions around private payers coming together with CM&S and companies on how to operationalize their input into clinical studies. So stay tuned. We'll see how this group evolves, but we've made good progress over the last year. Thank you.
All right, so we have the opportunity to accept questions from the audience for a short bit.
It's on now. On the computer modeling and simulation project, are you working with any of the PLM vendors who are actually developing some of those solutions to do modeling and simulation and building on what they're doing?
I wouldn't go as far as to say we're working with. We are aware of much of what they're doing. They are aware of much of what we're doing. We have a tighter partnership with the modeling and simulation companies directly, not as strong a relationship with the full PLM community. Another opportunity. As we look at integration of modeling into the whole product development lifecycle, there's a big opportunity to do modeling at every section, every stage of that lifecycle. And what we've communicated within the community is that starting that modeling baseline at the front end and building that incrementally throughout the life cycle is what we really want as a vision. And then having that model available to us as that product is on the market for any improvements, changes, fact-finding, that model is always a baseline we come back to. So it fits directly into the PLM mentality.
And I'll just add a piece to that, again, in late-breaking news. The FDA guidance document on the reporting of computational modeling results was just released today, this morning. It beat the paper by a few hours. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for the PLM manufacturers and the medical device community to start thinking about how we keep that history of the computer model over the life cycle. And that particular guidance document gives pieces of that. And some of the best work that we see out there, that reporting requirement is implemented as pretty much part of the push button, run the model activity. So good question.
This has been a great meeting, and I've really enjoyed hearing about all the different work that's going on. But I think that what's interesting to me is to hear a little bit from each of you about how you see this work building towards the different components of the NEST system as it moves forward, because you can see each of these as foundational pieces, either when it comes to methods or for the partnerships or the relationships. So if you could each speak about that, it would be really helpful.
would you like to start?
So that's a great question, and I think that's where a lot of the discussions that we had today with respect to the multiple parts that really have to be brought to bear in terms of how they interdigitate and how they will integrate is an area that's really ripe for a lot further work and discussion at this time.
It's interesting. I think the NEST project is one that is really valuable and needed. And I think at least the patient preference work, I think dovetails with it very well. It's a different type of data set. It's collected in a different way. And methodological issues, especially for quantitative patient preference assessment, are probably something hard to standardize in a way that would go directly into NEST. But I do think it will, that patient preferences around what we see as the risks and benefits of the technology derived from the surveillance system will be important. And we talk in our report about the value of patient preference information in the post-market evaluation of technology. And so I think the trick will be to marry those in a way that really helps understand not just how well the technology actually works in the field, but also how patients view how well it works in the field. And we'll continue to evolve the methods to be able to do that.
I think for computation modeling and simulation, there's a definite intersection between the data that we create, the models, and especially when we think about virtual patient and how that might intersect with the NEST initiative. I don't know yet to what level or to what part of the total life cycle we really engage deeply, but the virtual patient framework is probably the right place to start thinking about that intersection.
With respect to trying to lean out studies and using the 80-20 rule, of trying to get to the core data, I think NEST is going to be a centerpiece for this. First of all, we have to establish how to interact as partners, and we have research academia, industry, patients, and providers that need to understand how to become friends and develop a way of interacting. We have to embrace several secular trends that are occurring right now that have a lot of momentum. One of which is the learning healthcare system, the concept that we use existing data today to treat tomorrow's patient. Open science revolution. How do we move to a full data sharing system where we're not going to squirrel away data that is actually owned by the patients and should be liberated immediately? And then the data science parts. How do we get meaningful information from this really crazy and messy practice database system that we have so that we can leverage existing data and make it useful? Rather than have this parallel system we've had for years, which is to practice data of medicine using one database and study the practice of medicine using another database, which is redundant. Finally, with the motivation to lean out studies, I think we can generate a variety of new policies. And I want to point out two, one of which is this concept of pre-competitive space to really define what that means so we all feel comfortable working together. And the other is the attack on academic tenure, understand how to potentially change the notion of promoting people academically, not based on a number of articles that you're first author on, but based on the legacy of the data that you share. Dennis,
I think as it relates to the application of clinical trial practices, the NEST program represents a future opportunity. Right now, the work, as you've seen, has been focused on the traditional clinical study and trying to reduce the number of patient numbers and the burden of executing those kinds of studies. As NEST comes up, the promise is that that's going to create lower cost ways of collecting, more extensive data for decision making, and perhaps lighten the burden on the pre-approval phase of clinical trial work. All that is going to need some operationality to it, and once this gets established, people are going to wonder, okay, well, how do I take advantage of that? And I think that's where ACTP could come into a role as a working group to really say, okay, now that this is up and running in some fashion or other, can we work collaboratively to actually try it out in a couple practical ways and make use of it?
I think one other piece that we haven't said yes is validation of models. And you all have made such great comments. And I'll just add as one other piece, there are two kinds of models that we've been talking about today. One are these models for interesting approaches to adapting sizes and lengths of clinical trials. And while we see so much promise for that, NEST will allow us to continue the data collection and see whether or not we were right in a number of aspects around the thinking around the clinical trial. And then speaking as a physicist and a director of a lab program where there's a lot of mechanistic, physics, engineering, chemistry kinds of models, NEST is going to give us a beautiful ability to continue to mature and validate those models so that the kinds of things that we're doing today in the work that Tarek talked about, where we had, a prior, but we also had a constraint on the number of virtual patients because we can make infinite numbers of them. And so at the end of the day, we ended up making a decision around how much we were willing to let the model dominate the trial, just because there's, concern around that. And the more that we have data, the more that we'll be able to allow the virtual patient side to grow heavy with confidence, and NEST will help us get there.
Now, I'm so pleased to be able to announce one last late-breaking activity today. We're fortunate to be the first forum to be able to talk about the 2017 FDA regulatory science priorities. And so with that, I'm going to ask Suzanne to come back and tell us about those priorities.
Thanks very much, Dawn. I think you stole my thunder. I was about to use that same term, late-breaking news. I think that, so where I started from when we opened up this panel was mentioning that in 2015, we started this process of identifying what the regulatory science priorities were for CDRH, and I left it sort of as a cliffhanger there, so what's happened since that point in time? And I want to first of all acknowledge, because I see him sitting right there, Jake Cipriano, who did so much heavy lifting in terms of really spearheading the effort across the center in pulling together all of the offices and in going through the entire vetting process that you can actually read about in the publication that was just released yesterday, Regulatory Science Priorities for FY 2017. Which describes that process, describes the genesis of the priorities as well as what the priorities are for this year. And mainly I'd like to just kind of call your attention to a few of them that we've touched on quite a bit over the course of the day today, as these will be common themes: leveraging real-world evidence and employing evidence synthesis across multiple domains in regulatory decision-making, developing methods and tools to improve and streamline clinical trial design, developing computational modeling technologies to support regulatory decision-making, and collecting and using patient input in regulatory decision-making. So, and there are more, obviously, but these are the top 10 regulatory science priorities for fiscal year 2017. Once more, I really would encourage everyone to take a look at our website and to go through this document and to use this as an impetus that can drive the kind of further work on the collaborative front that we have already initiated here with MDIC over the past few years as a mechanism to really push and advance regulatory science forward to meet our overarching goals. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And with that, I'd like us to thank our panel for their time today and their insights. And I think Bill Murray has closing comments.
Thank you all, and thanks to the audience again for your active participation and engagement today. We had a chief medical officer meeting yesterday, and we talked about the coordinating center and some of the activities we were doing to within MDIC, and one of the chief medical officers made an analogy to the original Kennedy moonshot discussion. So different than the cancer moonshot, but when the space program was initiated. And he talked about how when that was first announced, it seemed like it was crazy, could never be done. There was all of the controversy that went with that. But the journey was started. There was a very clear goal. It was a goal, as he said, that a young child could understand and was very actionable, if you will. And it was deconstructed into different phases. So there was the Mercury phase, the Gemini phase, and then the Apollo phase. And so I'll just leave you with, on the coordinating center, I think that's one of our opportunities and challenges as we look at what is a grand vision. How do we deconstruct that down to an actionable, deliverable set of phases that we can execute upon and realize ultimately the vision that we were looking for and the opportunity with NEST. So I just wanted to leave you with that in terms of, I think, where we're going with the coordinating center and NEST. I'd like to wrap up. My staff's heard me say this multiple times, but so very pleased with the progress we're making at MDIC. I'm never satisfied. I won't be satisfied until the day I die. It's just in my DNA that if you become satisfied, you're complacent, and every day you got to wake up and be looking for how do you improve and how do you continue to evolve. What I will say, though, is I am extremely proud of our team and the participants and the people that have been involved in our projects. So we are a team of 4 people full-time and 3 contract, plus a tremendous network of volunteers that make all this work happen. So to the MDIC team, Chris, Carolyn, Stephanie, Dawn, Dan, Dwight, Carol, thank you all, because you made this a very successful meeting. And did I miss anybody? I think I got everybody. So thank you all, and thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.